Philip is a 23-year-old cafe owner. His best friend, Belle, has been by his side since childhood. They grew up in the same neighborhood and always ended up in the same classes. Belle has an older brother, Hector, who is just 2 years older than them. Hector and Philip got along well until one day, seemingly out of nowhere, they became enemies, unable to stand each other's company. Shortly after, Hector left to study law abroad. When he returned, he and Philip rarely spoke, and when they did, it was mostly to argue. Still, they couldn't avoid each other. Philip and Belle remained best friends, who visited often, and Hector was now Belle's next-door neighbor. One day, while working in his cafe, Philip received an alert for a large deposit into his account. He was stunned and couldn't think of anyone who'd send him such a sum. He planned to report it to the bank but got distracted serving customers and eventually forgot. Days passed, and the money slipped his mind until the police suddenly raided his cafe. They were tracking down a notorious gang involved in drug smuggling, money laundering, and other crimes and had noticed a transfer of money from them to his account. Philip panicked and tried to flee, but the police quickly caught him. Terrified and confused, he insisted he knew nothing about the gang, explaining he had meant to report the money but had forgotten. They ignored his protests, taking him in for questioning. His CAF was sealed and accounts were frozen and was now under investigation. Philip was allowed a phone call. Not wanting to worry his parents, he called Belle, but it was Hector who picked up. "Why do you have Belle's phone?" he asked, but Hector simply hung up. Desperate, Philip called back and reluctantly explained his situation, hoping Hector could help him as a lawyer. Again, Hector hung up without a word. When Philip tried calling again, there was no answer. Feeling hopeless, he sank to the floor, struggling to think of anyone else he could turn to. He knew he'd already looked guilty by trying to run, and feared making things worse with a wrong answer during questioning. Just when Philip was ready to give up, Hector appeared, with Belle right behind him, looking worried. Philip felt an overwhelming relief. He'd never been so happy to see Hector. Hector just went straight to gathering details and securing Philip's bail. When Philip was told he could leave, he jumped with joy, only for Hector to remark, "Don't get too excited. You still need to prove your innocence, or you'll end up right back here." Philip rolled his eyes at him. He then gave a grateful look. "Thanks for helping me. I really didn't think you'd come," he said. Hector replied, "I only came because Belle forced me to." Belle leaned over and whispered to Philip, "He's lying. He was so worried, he nearly left me behind in his rush to get here." As Hector and Belle got into Hector's car to leave, Philip stood awkwardly by the car. Belle leaned out and said, "Get in, what are you waiting for?" Hector muttered, "Why should he get in? We're not even heading the same direction." Belle replied, "Oh, he doesn't have money for a taxi, or even a bus, to get home." Hector rolled his eyes. "Then give him some." Belle shot back, "Will your car explode if you give him a ride?" Hector deadpanned, "Yes." With an exasperated huff, Belle got out, ushered Philip into the front seat beside Hector, fastened his seatbelt, and then climbed into the back. Philip, embarrassed, remained silent the entire ride, occasionally stealing glances at Hector. As soon as Hector dropped him off, he drove away without a word. Philip walked to his gate, only to realize his house had been sealed. Not only were his accounts frozen and his cafe shut down, but now his house was also locked up. He sank to the ground and murmured, "Why is this happening to me?" After a while, he decided to jump the fence and slip in through a window. He found an old ladder he'd thrown away, and mentally thanked himself for not getting rid of it completely. All the windows were sealed except for a small one, luckily just big enough for him to fit through. After taking a long, relaxing bath, Philip packed some clothes and grabbed a small stash of cash he had in a drawer. He spent the night there and, the next morning, jumped back out and took a taxi to Belle's house. When Belle opened the door, she looked surprised to see him standing there with a bag. Philip explained that his house was sealed and asked if he could stay with her until things were sorted out. He walked in casually, but just then, a man emerged from Belle's bedroom, draped in a blanket, asking who was at the door. He then noticed Belle looked a little disheveled, and Philip couldn't help but ask, did I interrupt something?" Belle grinned sheepishly, introducing the man as her boyfriend she was now living with, and introducing Philip as her best friend. Realizing that staying with Belle wasn't an option, Philip said he'd find a hotel until his house was back. Belle asked if he had enough money for that, and though Philip had grabbed some cash, he knew it wouldn't even cover one night. He shook his head. Belle told her boyfriend she'd be back soon, grabbed Philip by the hand with his bag, and led him outside. "Where are we going?" he asked. Belle replied, "To a place you can stay." As they walked, Philip started to realize where she was headed. He stopped. "No, I'd rather be homeless." Belle raised an eyebrow. "You don't really have a choice, do you?" Philip hesitated. "I doubt he'd even let me in." Belle replied, "He will. I don't know what happened between you two, but he still cares about you." Philip scoffed. "Who?" Belle insisted. "My brother has a good heart. He'd even let in a total stranger." Philip muttered, "Yeah, a total stranger. Definitely not me." Belle just sighed and dragged him up to Hector's doorstep. Belle pressed the doorbell, and when Hector opened the door and saw Philip standing there with a suitcase, he immediately shut it. Philip turned to Belle. "I told you," he muttered. Belle sighed, then reached under a vase, pulled out a spare key, and unlocked the door, tugging Philip inside. She dragged him over to Hector, gave a quick, "Please take care of him," and hurriedly left. Now, Philip was alone with Hector in the room. Hector glanced from Philip's luggage to Philip himself, then asked, "What is it now?" Philip hesitated. My house was sealed, so I have nowhere to go." Hector raised an eyebrow. "Then where'd you get a suitcase if your house is sealed?" Philip replied, "I got in through a window." Hector shook his head. "So, now you've added trespassing and breaking and entering to your list of crimes? How is it trespassing if it's my own house?" Philip shot back. "Well, it's not yours as long as it's sealed," Hector replied dryly. Philip took a deep breath. "Can I stay here until I get things sorted out?" Hector immediately replied, "No." Philip sighed. "I knew it." Hector narrowed his eyes. "Knew what?" "That you're heartless," Philip muttered. Hector just shook his head, grabbed Philip's luggage, and led him to a room. "You can stay here," he said. "My room's next door, so don't make noise while I'm sleeping, and don't go into my room." Philip scoffed. "Why would I want to go into your room?" "You never know," Hector replied. Philip paused. "You're really letting me stay here?" "Don't make me change my mind," Hector replied. A small smile crept onto Philip's face, and he murmured, almost inaudibly, "Thank you." Hector leaned in. "What?" "Couldn't hear you." "If you didn't hear it, then forget it," Philip replied. Just then, his stomach growled loudly, and he held his tummy glancing at Hector. "So, what are we having for lunch?" Hector raised an eyebrow. I already ate. You're on your own." He then turned and walked away. Philip quickly unpacked and headed to the kitchen. There were plenty of ingredients to cook, but he had no idea what to do with them. He didn't want to call Hector for help, so he stayed in the kitchen, mixing whatever he could find. By the end, he'd almost set the kitchen on fire. Smoke filled the room, and Philip, standing in the middle of it all, was coughing and trying to put out the burning pan. Hector rushed in, first pulling Philip out of the smoke, and scolding him, "Are you trying to get yourself killed?" He then went into the kitchen, put out the fire, and opened the windows to clear the smoke. Returning to Philip, Hector asked, somewhat reluctantly, "Are you okay?" Philip looked down, embarrassed. "Aren't you going to scold me for nearly burning your kitchen?" Hector sighed. "What difference would it make?" He then noticed a burn on Philip's finger, went to his room, and came back with some ointment, handing it over. Philip just held the ointment, staring at Hector. Hector sighed again, took the ointment back, and pulled Philip's hand, cooling the finger under cold running and applying the ointment to it. Philip's heart started racing as Hector carefully dabbed on the ointment and blew softly on it. After, Hector headed back to the kitchen to prepare a meal for him. Philip held his chest, mumbling to himself, "No, you can race for anyone but him." As he watched Hector, focused on chopping vegetables, sleeves rolled up and wearing an apron, Philip found himself staring and smiling until he caught himself and quickly looked away. He moved to sit at the dining table, wondering if living with Hector was really a good idea. Soon, Hector brought out a meal and placed it in front of Philip. The sight of food reminded him of his hunger, and he immediately began devouring it, forgetting even to thank Hector. With a shake of his head, Hector left and went back to his room. That night, as they were both sleeping, Hector rolled over and opened his eyes slightly, only to see a figure standing in the middle of his room in the dark. His eyes snapped open, fully alert. Looking closer, he recognized Philip. Is this really the time for pranks? Hector muttered, almost annoyed. But Philip didn't respond. He got up from the bed and walked over to Philip. His eyes were open, but he wasn't responding to anything. Hector then realized he was sleepwalking. Gently, Hector took Philip's hand and led him back to his room, tucking him into bed before returning to his own. But as Hector lay in bed, he found he couldn't sleep, worrying that Philip might start sleepwalking again and get himself hurt. After considering his options, he did the only thing he could think of. He carefully tied Philip to the bed, making sure it was secure but not too tight. The next morning, Hector woke up late. His alarm had failed, and he had a client meeting he was now scrambling not to miss. He rushed to get ready and bolted out the door, completely forgetting that Philip was still tied to the bed. On his way to the meeting, he finally remembered, nearly stopping in his tracks. He quickly called Belle, asking if she could stop by his house and untie Philip. But Belle just replied she wasn't home, and when Hector asked why she was out so early, she replied, "None of your business, bye." Realizing he had no other option, Hector called his client to apologize for running late. To his relief, the client told him that something had come up on her end too, and she suggested rescheduling for later in the day. Hector turned the car around and headed home, stopping to grab breakfast for Philip on the way. Meanwhile, Philip had woken up to find himself tied to the bed with no way to break free. Instantly, he knew it had to be Hector's doing. After all, it was just them both that lived in the house. After struggling so hard to break free and couldn't, he just gave up, laying in the bed and cursing Hector in his mind. Hector got home and immediately rushed to Philip's room to untie him. Before he could explain his reason for doing so, Philip said, "I know you hate me, but don't you think this is childish?" Hector no longer explained himself and just walked out after untying him, saying, "I bought breakfast. Left it on the dining table. You can eat it if you want." Philip watched Hector leave, wondering if he had said anything harsh. Hector returned to his office and had some time before his rescheduled meeting. He started reading up on sleepwalking, learning that tying someone up wasn't exactly recommended. He read about its causes and how to handle it. Back at the house, Philip ate the breakfast Hector had left and, after finishing everything he had to do, he began to feel the weight of boredom. Normally, he'd visit Belle, but her home wasn't an option anymore. He called to check if she was alone, but she replied that she wasn't home at all. With nothing to do, Philip aimlessly wandered around the house, playing games on his phone until his mind drifted elsewhere. He realized he'd been everywhere in the house except for Hector's room. He didn't have a real reason to go in, but curiosity and boredom got the better of him. He looked around the tidy room, opening drawers and photo albums. Flipping through, he found a picture of Hector with a girl, taken back when he'd gone abroad for school. They were kissing in the photo, and Philip felt an unexpected pang of jealousy knotting in his chest. He closed the album and left the room. He questioned himself why he was jealous, why he was angry. Hector could do whatever he wanted with whoever he wanted. Feeling suffocated in the house, Philip decided to go for a walk to clear his mind. He wandered aimlessly, and before he knew it, he was near Belle's house, where her boyfriend, Eric, stood out front. Philip didn't notice him until Eric called out his name. "Oh, hey, didn't see you there," Philip greeted. "It's fine," Eric replied with a smile, then asked, "Got something on your mind?" Philip shrugged. "Nah, not really." They exchanged a few casual words, and amid their conversation, Eric unexpectedly mentioned he was bisexual, even though it didn't relate to anything they'd been discussing. Philip nodded politely, but wondered why Eric felt the need to share that with him. Later that night, when Hector came home, Philip remembered the photo he'd seen in Hector's room, and a flash of jealousy returned. Hector, noticing his expression, asked if he'd had dinner. Philip replied curtly, "Yeah, I have." Hector assumed Philip was still upset over being tied to the bed and offered an apology. "Sorry about this morning." Philip blinked. "Huh? Oh, I'd forgotten about that." Hector asked, "Then why are you mad?" Philip replied, "Mad? Who's mad? I'm not mad." "Okay," Hector said with a shrug, heading to his room. Before bed, Hector went through the house, making sure to move anything that might be dangerous if Philip sleepwalked, and locking every door that needs to be locked. He then handed him a small bed alarm that would notify him if Philip got up during the night. "What's this?" Philip asked. "Just put it under your bed," Hector said simply. "Why should I?" Philip asked. With a sigh, Hector brushed past him and set it under the bed himself, telling him to not take it out. Over the following days, Hector stayed alert even in his sleep, and whenever the alarm sounded, he would rush to Philip's room. Sometimes Philip was simply awake for a glass of water or a trip to the bathroom. But when he was sleepwalking, Hector would gently guide him back to bed and stay until he was settled. Usually, Philip wouldn't get up again once he was back in bed. During the day, they quarreled nonstop, and at night, Hector took care of Philip. Whenever Philip hung out at Belle's place, her boyfriend gave him strange looks and seemed to flirt whenever they were alone together. Philip eventually began avoiding Belle's place when her boyfriend was around. One evening, as Hector was making dinner and Philip watched him in the kitchen, he decided to voice his concern. "I feel like Belle's boyfriend is hitting on me." Hector paused, turning to Philip. "What do you mean?" he asked, and Philip explained Eric's behavior. Hector clenched his fists, visibly angry. "I knew there was a reason I didn't like him." He then asked if Philip had told Belle. Philip admitted he hadn't, and Hector began undoing his apron. Philip asked what he was doing, and Hector replied, "I'm going to tell Belle to break up with that jerk." Philip panicked and stopped him. "I don't think we should tell her yet. Maybe I'm mistaken, and it's all in my head." Hector responded firmly, "You're not mistaken. From what you've told me, he really is hitting on you. I wish I could just knock his teeth out." Impulsively, Philip asked, "Are you mad because he's hitting on me, or because he's cheating on your sister?" Hector went silent, then replied, "For my sister, of course." Philip nodded, a bit disappointed. "We'll tell her later, after I get some proof." Hector agreed, then hesitantly added, "Be careful around him." Philip eventually gathered evidence of Eric making advances, but couldn't bring himself to tell Belle. One day, Belle walked in, collapsed onto the couch, and announced, "I broke up with Eric. I caught him cheating." Hector came over. Finally, Belle sighed, explaining that she didn't want to stay in her house, as everything reminded her of Eric, and asked if she could stay with them for a week. Hector scoffed. "Why'd you even let that jobless prick live with you in the first place?" Belle started to tear up. "Because I loved him. Can't you just comfort me?" Hector sighed and walked away as Philip came over to hug her. A week later, Belle was still staying with them, and was never bothered by Hector and Philip's frequent bickering, as she was already used to it. One day, as Hector and Philip were arguing, Hector noticed a piece of fuzz in Philip's hair and reached out to pull it. Philip gasped, "Did you just grab my hair?" Before Hector could explain, Philip grabbed his hair with both hands. Hector told him to let go, but Philip refused, and they tightened their grips, pulling each other's hair like little girls in a fight. Belle sat on the couch, snacking and watching them. She couldn't help but wonder how the two of them ended up like this when they used to be so close. Belle approached the two and asked, "What happened between you guys? You used to be so close." Philip, releasing Hector's hair, replied, "Ask him." Hector rolled his eyes and countered, "Maybe you have the answer to that." Philip scoffed, "You're the one who started being rude to me first." Hector let go of Philip's hair, "And whose fault was that?" Philip looked at him, confused. "How is this my fault?" Hector shot back, "You were the one who thought it was funny to play with someone's feelings." Philip and Hector had once been really close. They'd both liked each other, even though neither had ever said it out loud. They could just feel it. When Hector was in his final year of high school, Philip decided it was time to confess his feelings, hoping they could enjoy the last bit of time together as an official couple before Hector went off to college. He'd planned to tell him on Hector's birthday, but he couldn't wait and ended up confessing earlier. However, as soon as he said the words, Philip panicked and ran off before Hector could answer. He'd thought he was ready to hear Hector's response, but he wasn't. Hector had also been planning to confess his feelings to Philip, but Philip beat him to it, and then ran off before Hector could respond. Hector decided that officially asking Philip to be his boyfriend on his birthday would make for the perfect gift. He chose to wait until then, hoping to give a heartfelt answer and confess his feelings properly. A few days later, Philip went over to Belle's house to do homework, stopping by Hector's room like he always did. Noticing Hector was with his friends, he decided to leave quietly. Just as he turned away, he heard one of Hector's friends mention his name, and curiosity got the best of him. He stayed, listening, as Hector's friend asked, "Are you and Philip dating?" Hector responded with a dismissive laugh. "You? No, why would you think that? I'm not like that twink. I only like girls, hot girls." Philip ran straight home and cried his heart out in his room. On Hector's birthday, there was a party, and though Philip didn't want to attend, Belle insisted. During the celebration, Hector pulled him aside and brought up Philip's confession, saying he was ready to give his answer. Philip laughed, brushing it off with, "You actually thought I was serious? It was just a prank. I didn't think you'd believe me." He forced a laugh, trying to keep his composure, while Hector's expression fell. Hector asked quietly, "Why are you acting like this?" Philip replied with a shrug, "Acting like what? Relax, it was just a harmless joke." Hector's tone grew more intense. "Is this funny to you?" Philip's smile faltered, and he quickly said, "I've gotta go, curfew's soon." "Don't forget to save me a slice of cake." He playfully nudged Hector's shoulder before leaving, but inside, he felt his heart shattering. Hector just stood there, reeling from the exchange. He left his own party and went to his room, where he tried to hold back his emotions, but soon found himself in tears. The next day at school, the two crossed paths. Trying to act casual, Philip put a hand on Hector's shoulder. "Hey, did you save that slice of cake for me?" Hector stared back, no longer seeing the Philip he knew. He brushed Philip's hand off his shoulder, looking visibly irritated. Philip muttered sarcastically, "Didn't know I was too dirty to touch you now." Hector shot back with equal sarcasm, "Didn't know you were so immature." Philip muttered under his breath, pot calling the kettle black, and just like that, their relationship dissolved into constant quarrels and resentment. Philip asked, "Whose feelings did I play with?" Hector replied, "Mine." Philip's eyes narrowed. "You were the one who played with mine, acting like you had feelings for me when you didn't." Belle, watching them both, gasped, "Wait, you'd dated behind my back?" In unison, they both replied, "We never dated," then went right back to their argument. Hector continued, "I should be saying that about you." Philip fired back, "You're the one who insulted and made fun of me with your friends." Hector looked genuinely confused. "I never did that." "Sure, you don't remember," Philip muttered bitterly. Hector, trying to recall, thought for a moment. His expression changed as it clicked. "Wait, we weren't talking about you. We were rehearsing for a project. It was a script for a short film we were making back then." Philip scoffed. "What a convenient excuse," Hector insisted. "I swear, it was just for the film." Desperate to prove his innocence, he ran to his room, turning everything upside down until he found an old camera. After checking it was still working, he searched for the short film and brought it to Philip. The film portrayed a character struggling to admit to his friends he was gay and kept denying his boyfriend. After watching, Philip asked, his tone softer, "Why did you use my name?" Hector replied immediately, "I didn't write the script. I just had to act it out." He looked at Philip earnestly. "It wasn't about you. It was just the script." Philip went silent, realizing he had misunderstood everything. Hector then asked, "What about you? Was your confession really a prank?" Philip quickly shook his head. "No, only said that because I thought you were mocking me with your friends. I didn't know how else to take back my confession, so I did that. I didn't want to give you the chance to hurt me." Hector said softly, "I thought my feelings for you were pretty obvious. I guess they weren't as clear as I thought." Philip looked at him, hesitating. "Did you really like me?" Without hesitation, Hector replied, "I did. So much." Belle, who was still standing nearby, watched them in awe, wondering how she never noticed something going on between them. Philip sighed, falling silent. Then, he looked at Hector apologetically. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have jumped to conclusions after eavesdropping for just a second. I'm sorry for hurting you like that." Hector shook his head. "No one's at fault. I should have known you wouldn't do something like that. I should have just talked to you instead of acting immature. We were young and dumb." Philip hesitated, then asked, "Do you think we would have been together now if it weren't for all the misunderstandings?" Hector shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe we would have. Maybe we wouldn't. Maybe it just wasn't the right time for us." They both nodded slowly, falling into an awkward silence. By now, Belle had slipped away to her room, already gone to bed. Finally, Philip broke the silence. So, are we cool now? Hector asked. Do you want us to be? Philip quickly nodded, and a smile broke out on Hector's face. Me too. Philip then asked, so, what are we now? Hector looked slightly taken aback, and Philip quickly added, I mean, friends. Are we friends like before? Hector scratched the back of his neck awkwardly. Yeah, I guess. Okay, Philip said, nodding as they lapsed into another silence, both glancing at the clock and realizing how late it had gotten. Hector said, we should probably go to bed. Yeah, Philip agreed. The moment Philip got to his room, he flopped onto his bed, hugging his pillow and grinning ear to ear, thinking of how Hector had admitted he'd liked him. Then he paused, wondering if Hector still felt that way now. On the other side, Hector paced around his room, unable to stop smiling either. The next morning, both of them stepped out of their rooms at the same time. They exchanged greetings and Hector noticed Philip was dressed up. Going out? Hector asked. Philip shook his head. No. Hector gave a quick smile. Are you hungry? I was about to make breakfast. Philip nodded. Philip asked to help and said he wanted to learn to cook. Hector chuckled. All right, how about I guide you? And you cook? Philip beamed, excitedly agreeing. He started by washing the vegetables, just as Hector had asked. As he began chopping, he nearly nicked his finger. Hector swiftly took the knife from him, saying, maybe I should do it instead. You can sit and watch. But I want to learn, Philip insisted. Hector shook his head gently. I don't want you to hurt yourself. He took Philip's hand, softly inspecting his fingers, then remarked, that burn from last time is still there. I don't want you getting hurt anymore. Philip felt his heart flutter as he sat and watched Hector work in the kitchen. When they finally sat down to eat, Belle wandered in, only to find no food left for her. She sighed and asked about it, to which Hector replied, I forgot you were still living here. When are you leaving? Your house is just a stone's throw away. Belle laughed sarcastically. I see I'm not welcome here anymore. Philip offered her some of his food, but she waved it off, deciding to eat out instead. Hector and Philip grew closer, more so than ever, and Belle soon moved back to her own home, finding their closeness a constant reminder of her own single status. She couldn't even enjoy the usual drama. They hardly argued anymore. One night, Hector was woken by the alarm he'd set on Philip's bed, which notified him whenever Philip moved from his bed. He went out to check and found Philip in the kitchen, just getting a glass of water. Seeing Hector, Philip asked curiously, how are you always awake whenever I am? Hector sighed, realizing it was time to tell him about his sleepwalking. He explained everything, including the bed alarm. Philip had caught himself sleepwalking once before, but hadn't realized it happened so frequently. Concerned, he asked if it wasn't exhausting for Hector to get up in the middle of the night, just to guide him back to bed each time. Hector shook his head. I've never thought of it as exhausting. Still, Philip replied, I feel bad about it. Hector hesitated, then suggested, would you like to sleep with me instead? Philip choked on his water, and Hector quickly added, I mean, just sleeping, nothing else. I know, Philip replied. If you're by my side, I wouldn't have to get up, Hector reasoned. Philip bit his lip, hesitating to give an answer. Hector's words trailed off. It's okay if you don't want to, Philip swiftly countered. I want to. Hector smiled, and they walked to his room together. As they settled into bed, they initially lay apart, but gradually, both scooted closer until there was no space left between them. Hector turned to face Philip, wrapping an arm around him. I should hold you, so you don't go wandering off. Philip buried his face in Hector's chest, hiding a wide, shy smile. In the following nights, Hector and Philip continued sleeping together, cuddling closely. Hector also helped Philip seek medical help for his sleepwalking. One night, as they lay together, wrapped in each other's arms, Philip's curiosity got the best of him, remembering the photo he'd seen in Hector's old album. He hesitated, but finally asked, Did you date anyone when you were studying abroad? Hector shook his head. No, I didn't, Philip muttered under his voice, liar. Hector heard him and asked, Why do you think I'm lying? Philip told him about the picture he had seen in his album. Hector responded, I'd forgotten about that. Does it count as dating if it was all for show? Philip nodded. It still counts. Hector sighed. I guess I did date then. Noticing Philip's jealous expression, he explained she was just a friend who helped him out when he was new. They only pretended to date to get rid of her obsessed ex-girlfriend. Philip asked, did you really have to keep that picture in your album? Without a moment's hesitation, Hector got up. I'll take it out right now, he said, and promptly removed it from the album, dropping it into the bin. Philip blinked. Why would you do that? It's your life, your photo album, your lips. Hector returned to bed. If it makes you jealous, then I have to get rid of it. Flustered, Philip stammered. I'm not jealous. At all. What right do I have to be? Hector leaned in closer. I already gave you that right. But if you want it in an official way then, accept to be my boyfriend. Philip's eyes widened. Huh? Hector took a breath, his gaze unwavering. I love you. I tried to move on, but I couldn't. I never stopped loving you. And now, I don't want to stop. Philip just stared at him, speechless. Seeing this, Hector's expression started to falter. You don't feel the same way, do you? A smile spread across Philip's face as he said, I love you too. Relief and joy flooded Hector's face. Then, are you willing to enter into a lifelong relationship with me? Philip leaned closer, grinning. Where do I sign? Hector pointed to his chest. Right here. Philip leaned in and kissed Hector's chest. Hector then pointed to his lips. And here too. Smiling, Philip placed a soft kiss on his lips, and Hector pulled him into a soft, passionate kiss. When they finally parted, Philip shyly asked, should we do more than just sleep tonight? Hector's eyes lit up. Do you want that? Philip nodded. Do you? With a smirk, Hector gently pushed him onto the bed. I never thought this day would come, he murmured, kissing Philip softly on his forehead, then his cheeks, nose, and finally his lips. His kisses traveled down to Philip's neck as they shared a passionate night in each other's arms. The next morning, Philip opened his eyes to find Hector watching him, fingers gently brushing through his hair. When he noticed Philip's eyes opening, Hector smiled warmly. Good morning. How was your night? Blushing, Philip quickly pulled the covers over his face, hiding his shy smile. Chuckling softly, Hector leaned over and kissed him through the blanket. With Hector's help, the police were able to catch the wanted gang members, and Philip's name was finally cleared. His properties were returned, which meant he had to move back to his own home. He didn't want to leave, but he had to since he had a cafe to run, and it was conveniently near his house. Each morning, Hector would make breakfast for Philip and bring it over. He also spent his evenings at Philip's house, making dinner, and simply enjoying each other's company.